And with that, I turn it over to our distinguished scholar and friend, Dr. Edmund Ghareeb.
Hey everyone, it's a pleasure to see you all here today. I think this is a very important moment in history in a sense. What's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in the United States. I think this is a very, very important situation. Unfortunately, what we are, despite the ceasefire, we are continuing to see the death of hundreds of people, including particularly many women and children and old men, civilians in Gaza. We are also seeing the continued prevention of trucks going into Gaza. There was supposed to be about 600 trucks supposed to go every day. And since then, if you count all the trucks that went in, according to UN, there are only about 82 trucks a day on the average. And in addition to this, we are continuing to see also the military attacks by Israel and the violations of the ceasefire in Gaza. We're also seeing settlers and Israeli soldiers also committing a lot of violations in the West Bank, and we're seeing attacks on Syria and on Lebanon. So that raises question, which we heard about also from the previous speakers, and this is the impunity that Israel seems to be getting away with murder to a large extent. What we are seeing is very unfortunate, but we have an excellent group of authors and speakers. Let's start with Phyllis, actually.
Okay. Thank you, Edmund, and thank you all for being here today. The Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center can always be counted on for fascinating discussions and good questions from informed audiences. It's always a pleasure to be here. You know, I was asked to speak about the U.S. role in Gaza and in the genocide, U.S. policy, which I must say this year has been a lot harder to talk about in many ways because the administration in power right now does not have the same kind of traditional understandings of U.S. imperialism, U.S. interventions, you know, accountability to various factions of wealth and power in this country. It is led by someone who is much more focused on his own position, that is of his family. But we should not assume, I think, that because of that it means that somehow the U.S. is less engaged or less empowered, less enabling of particularly what Israel is doing in the region. You know, I look at the Israeli press a lot, which it's very useful to do that. I mean, you have to take a deep breath and get ready when you read it, but it's important to sort of see how they are perceiving and how their population is being told what the world is doing about what they are doing. The headline on a few days ago was this: Netanyahu and Kushner discuss Gaza plan amid standoff over trapped Hamas terrorists. That was the headline. The subhead: U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff expected to join Israel talks. Turkey said mediating on hostages. UAE likely to send troops to Gaza. Now, what's missing from all that language? One thing is Palestinians, right? They're not there. There's not only no agency, there's no presence in the Israeli understanding of what they face. It goes on in this article. Here's a quote. An Israeli government spokesman said that Netanyahu and Kushner discussed disarming Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza, and ensuring Hamas does not have a future role in Gaza, all central components of the second phase of U.S. President Donald Trump's Gaza peace plan. Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and Aria Lightstone, a senior advisor to U.S. Mideast envoy Steve Witkoff, also participated in the Jerusalem meeting with Kushner, which took place ahead of an expected visit by Witkoff to Israel as part of continued efforts to advance Trump's plan. Again, who's not there, right? So this is the framework that we're looking at. The U.S. is calling all the shots. You know, I wrote a book many years ago about U.S. domination of the UN that's called Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's UN. But this is a moment when, despite the fact that Trump is much harder to predict, partly because he doesn't seem to have a very, well, how shall I say this? It does not seem to have a very wide attention span. He has a narrow attention span. So whether the focus right now on Gaza, on a peace plan, the Gaza Riviera, all of this even exists a few months from now, we don't know. What we do know is the people around him on this issue are very committed to this issue. They are not fly-by-nights. These are people who have, I mean, except a few of them probably are, but most of them are not. These are people who have been part of directing policy in the Middle East for a long time. So, and Trump, of course, himself has been consistent in his support for Israel. He's been inconsistent in how that support should be shown or what it would look like. But there hasn't been a real shift politically. There is a lot of consistent self-interest when we look at how policy gets formed. So for Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, he, of course, has talked about Gaza as beautiful beachfront property, a future of profit. And of course, his father-in-law, Trump, speaks of the creation of the Gaza Riviera on the Mediterranean, right? This is what is going to be the goal. The sons of Steve Witkoff, who came to this pretty new, this was not a big passion for him. He was an old friend of Trump's. They kind of grew up together as real estate guys. His sons, he has two sons that are both involved in getting money from various Gulf states, from their sovereign wealth funds for investment in more real estate in the US. So the UAE, Qatar, Saudi are all negotiating with these guys to see what kind of investments they could make, which would put them in a better position with the United States and with Israel, of course. Trump's position, for example, on the so-called Abraham Accords, which are the normalization agreements between a number of Arab states and Israel, now it's being brought in Kazakhstan, which I don't know when Kazakhstan became an Arab state, but okay. Kazakhstan, it's a little weird. Kazakhstan has had very solid relationships with Israel for more than a decade. So I don't know exactly what this is about, but apparently this is a new big thing. But what Trump said about the Abraham Accords, he was talking about the willingness of the Arab regimes to continue in this process, which we should note is far more about what the United States is going to provide for its Arab allies in terms of more weapons, better weapons, and in the case of Saudi Arabia, the possibility of a nuclear power project, which they've never been able to have. All of that is far more important than the normalization process, but it's being billed as a normalization process. And Trump said that the reason that the Arab countries in the Abraham Accords are sticking with it, he said, quote, all countries that signed stayed because it was really good business, which is, I think, true. I think our president tells the truth. That is absolutely right. These are business deals, particularly arms business. But what isn't going on? What isn't going on, as we've been hearing all morning from our earlier two brilliant speakers, is that there is no ceasefire. There is a reduction fire, perhaps, and that's not nothing. The fact that we're seeing the killing of 25 or 50 Palestinians every day is not the same as when there were 150 every day. These are real lives that we're talking about, not numbers. So that is not nothing, but it is not a ceasefire. It was decided by the US and Israel, and then they signed it and then presented it to the Palestinians and said, you have 72 hours to sign. And if you don't, the war goes on. This was not a ceasefire between two warring sides. It was presented as an ultimatum. The ceasefire is completely inadequate, but it is important, I think, for us to remember that it happened only because there had been this massive upsurge of global pressure from governments and from people, most importantly from people, from us, from civil society, from social movements, putting the pressure on to say this is not acceptable. We will not live in a world where we can watch 24/7 on our phones, on our TVs, on our computers, on our screens, on our in our televisions, in our radios, in our newspapers, seeing a genocide up close and personal. That has never happened in this world. When the genocide in Rwanda was going on in 1994, Saeed will remember this at the UN, it was being talked about at the UN. It was known. It was not a secret. And it was talked about a little bit in the US press. It was anybody who wanted to find out could find out, but it was not visible. We didn't see the horrors of that genocide that went on for 3 months on a horrific killing spree. We didn't see it. Right now, we are seeing this. And that made all the difference. That was a huge difference. This is not, because of the ceasefire right now, we are not seeing the kind of full-scale ethnic cleansing that we had been seeing earlier. I think there is a very grave danger that we are about to go back to that. But this has been a break, in a sense, of that. I know that people here, and I think probably people watching online, are very familiar with the details of the so-called peace plan, the 20-point peace plan of Trump. It was one of these things where nobody really knew what it was when it was announced with great fanfare. Trump maybe knew what it was, maybe didn't, but he put it forward with great fanfare and nobody knew what it was. The Palestinians were presented it at the same moment that it broke on CNN, right, on that Sunday. It was like, wait, what just happened here? Who negotiated this? What makes this a peace plan? What makes this a ceasefire? They then went off to Sharm el-Sheikh and had these discussions where, again, Palestinians weren't even present. Palestinians didn't sign on to anything. What Israel agreed to was a one-sided, what they called a ceasefire. So what we now know is that the 20 points do not include one very important point, which is a total withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, the freedom of Gaza. That's not in there. What is in there is the moving of Israeli troops, at least some of them. They drew these lines on the map. Remember, there was one map with it. It was all sort of, the rest was all gibberish, and then there was a map. And on the map, they had colored lines. There was a yellow line, and then I think it was a red line and a blue line. So right now, the Israeli troops withdrew, which makes it sound like they're leaving, right? Well, they're not leaving. They are still in Gaza. But they moved from occupying the entire strip to consolidating their forces along the so-called yellow line. That divides the Gaza Strip into two parts. Remember how tiny Gaza is. Remember how crowded, that we always used to talk about Gaza as one of the most crowded places on the face of the earth. Well, now 95% of the population of Gaza, which is almost 2 million people, are now crowded into 43% of Gaza. 53%, is that what it is? 47 and 53, yeah, 47% is where the Palestinians are. 53% is controlled by Israel, where there are no Palestinians, right? And that's the part that includes the most fertile parts of Gaza. It includes a little bit of water that's there is on the Israeli side. And I don't know how many of you saw the new leak report a few days ago in Politico, and then it moved to a few other places. It seems that people in and around the State Department are now saying, we don't know whether we're going to be able to pull this off. This whole peace process thing really may not work. You want to say, yeah, you think? You know, I mean, where have you people been? Of course it's not going to work. But their understanding of, quote, working is obviously very different from ours. And they are now saying that from their vantage point, by their standards, it may not work. So what does it mean if it works or if it doesn't work? Right now, the US owns the process of colonization across Gaza, and it's increasing in the West Bank, but particularly in Gaza. This is the new Middle East that Tony Blair has talked about, that other US presidents and other officials have talked about, that Donald Trump is talking about now. You know, the term that they use, I don't know, some of you may have seen the diagram of this occupation that is set to replace the straight Israeli occupation with a broader global occupation led by something called the Peace Board, which will be chaired by one Donald Trump, right? And who's going to be the CEO of the Peace Board? Yeah. Tony Blair. Now, why does this all start to sound familiar? Why does this sound like the occupation of Iraq? Even when we look at the language, the Gaza International Transitional Authority, Does that sound like the Iraq Coalition Provisional Authority? You know, why would that be so familiar? Because Tony Blair is involved with both of them, right? So this is what we're looking at. The US is in charge of the official recolonization of Gaza and presumably the rest of Palestine with it, control of the new Middle East, very much a return to the post-World War I mandate system. Except this time there were no mandates handed out by, here it would be the United Nations, then it was the League of Nations. This time it's the US asserting itself. And the problem is, despite all of the evidence that the US empire is weaker than it has been for a long time in a whole bunch of ways, it's being challenged economically by China, it's being challenged militarily in a bunch of places on a small scale, although it remains by far the most powerful military power in the world, not least because it spends now $1 trillion every year. That's what the military budget this year is now, over $1 trillion. It's one of those numbers that you might as well say a gazillion for all that it actually means something. I mean, does anybody here really think you know what $1 trillion anything looks like? I can't imagine $1 million. You know, $1 million is a huge amount of money. But when you're talking about the military budget, 3.8 billion, which is what Israel officially was getting every year for the last 10 years, is chump change. It's a rounding error. It's not even on the table. But now we're talking real money. Now we're talking $1 trillion. So we can't pretend that the US is not still the most powerful military force in the Middle East and elsewhere, increasingly around Venezuela. So when Israel attacks Iran, the US says, oh, okay, we'll join. And the US goes and joins its attack on Iran. Israel then tries to assassinate Palestinian negotiators in Qatar, and the US responds somewhat differently. It goes to the Israelis and says, you got to apologize for that one. And Netanyahu says, why? And he says, because Qatar's a good guy. Qatar's on our side. You know that base we have in Qatar? That's the biggest military base the US has in the entire Middle East. That's important to us. And by implication, it might even be more important than you are, which isn't probably politically true, but strategically may well be true. So that's a very different approach. And what a surprise. Netanyahu did as he was told. The US handed him literally a piece of paper on the phone and said, here's the phone, here's your apology, read it. And you know what it reminded me of? I've got to say, in a different context, in 1988, when there was a move at the United Nations for Palestine to be recognized, the PLO to be recognized. And in order to make the US agree, there was an agreement that Arafat had to say certain things in his speech. I remember it very well, yeah. And this was after, of course, Arafat had been denied the right to come to the United Nations because the US wouldn't give him a visa. So the whole UN, security guards, interpreters, clerks, everybody packed up and flew off to Geneva for a day. It was like, talk about a waste of money and destruction of the planet, but okay. They go to Geneva, Arafat gives his speech, everybody applauds, they go off to the receptions and the whatever, and the word comes a few hours later, that wasn't good enough. You didn't say the magic words. So remember, everybody was pulled back to the whatever, the hall at the UN headquarters in Geneva, and Arafat got up again and made a very short speech using some very specific language that the State Department had dictated. You need to say this if we're going to change our position. He did. The US changed its position and allowed a low-ranking diplomat, it was the deputy ambassador to Tunis, as I recall, something like that, who was then allowed. Sorry?
The deputy
was Pelletro. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, a low-ranking deputy was allowed to say hello to the PLO leader. That was in Tunis. Yeah. So this was all, you know, it was all sounding very familiar. The question of the US role in the region has everything to do not only with Israel, but with the Arab states as well. And, you know, what does this mean? The UAE is arming the RSF in Sudan. The State Department just earlier this year, of course, it was under a different administration, but nonetheless, the US State Department has determined that what is going on in Sudan is genocide, the word they will not say for Gaza. They have said it for Sudan. Their close ally, the UAE, is funding and arming the RSF that is committing the genocide. So the question of how the U.S. deals with all this becomes very, very complicated. So right now, the U.S. is discussing this question of, is the 20-point plan even viable? Is it possible? The stabilization force. Remember, this is not a protection force. This is not what my friend Craig Mulheiber was talking about, of what we need. This is what the U.S. is imposing. A stabilization force whose mandate would be to protect Egypt and Israel from any bad thing that might happen in Gaza, meaning to protect those countries from Palestinian resistance, from even Palestinian Samud, from maybe Palestinians moving to Gaza, to Egypt. It's all of those things. The peace board, what's that going to be? We know that Trump's going to be the chair of it, but what's it going to be? This is what we're talking about. So the challenge that we face, and let me just say a couple of challenges, and then 1 minute on the international situation, and then I'm going to wrap up. And that is, we've had enormous success in this country over these 2 years, globally, much more visibly. But in this country, where we thought it was never going to happen, I never thought in my lifetime I was going to see polls like we've seen, 77% of Democrats saying no more arms to Israel, 56 members of the House of Representatives saying they want to be co-sponsors of a resolution saying block the bombs going to Israel. I never thought we would see these things. And we are seeing it now all the time. It's been an enormous success in changing public discourse. We've seen some success in the media, despite the fact that it still is terrible. It's way better than it ever was before because it's been forced to. There's been enormous pressure in the media. And we're seeing the glimmers of a shift at the policy level. It's just beginning, but it is starting in a way that I think has surprised many of us. But there are two big contradictions and two challenges that we have to recognize. The contradictions are, one, we need that shift in the narrative and in the media before there can be a policy shift. But those narrative shifts are never enough. That's the first contradiction. The second contradiction is that we're seeing those shifts that are inevitably medium and long-term actions. And we don't have medium-term left in Gaza. People are being killed on a daily basis. The comparison with South Africa is a powerful one. But one big difference is that as repressive and horrific as the lives of Black South Africans was throughout the decades of apartheid, they were not facing genocide. They were not being killed by the hundreds between hunger and being bombed on a daily basis. And that meant that the anti-apartheid movement that lasted for decades could succeed and still have a population there to fight for the final parts of it to overturn the apartheid for their own governments. And we have two big challenges. One is that we are living right now in an era of rising authoritarianism and rising fascism around the world and in this country. So it's much harder to move from the discourse and media shift to the actual policy change. It's much harder because the institutions of democracy are being destroyed as we look at them. So the other challenge is, how do we both strengthen the movement for Palestinian rights and simultaneously make that movement central to the movement that is rising against apartheid and against fascism and against authoritarianism that is rising in this country? How do we make that combination work? You know, how do we link the 80 Palestinian detainees who have been killed in Israeli prisons in these 2 years with the 20 dead ICE detainees who have been killed in ICE detention just this year alone? How do we make those links stronger and clearer? And then finally, on the question of the international part, we have been so inspired by what South Africa did, bringing to the International Court of Justice the charge of genocide for the first time, saying to the world, Israel is guilty of genocide. And the court saying 2 weeks later, yes, this is plausibly genocide. This isn't our final word on it, but it is plausible that this is genocide, and the actions of Israel are unacceptable, and these 6 actions must be stopped right now. Very, very clear. And yes, Israel is still ignoring that. But what that says is that our movements must be the enforcers of international law. As Craig was talking about earlier, the International Court of Justice doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a police force. It doesn't even have a process server to run around the world serving papers on violating governments. What it does have is the UN General Assembly, which passed that extraordinary resolution in September of last year, under Uniting for Peace, calling for sanctions, calling for arms restrictions, calling for almost all of these things except for a protection force. That's true. And that has been unknown to be true in the General Assembly. Of course, the General Assembly has no vetoes. The US routinely votes against all of these things that pass with huge majorities in the General Assembly. But at the same time, we see a moment when we, civil society movements, can take the lessons of the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s against apartheid South Africa and say, you know, we saw it work then, and we know it can still work. What worked? What worked was the same thing happened then. People went to the Security Council, tried to get sanctions. The US would veto it every time. They'd go to the General Assembly. They'd be voted on huge majorities, and they would then, the US would say, well, we don't care because the General Assembly resolutions are not binding in international law. But guess what? People took those lists of sanctions that had been passed by the General Assembly, went to their own governments and said, okay, this is what you've got to do. We don't want to be an outlier country. We want to be a country that is abiding by international law, including resolutions of the General Assembly. And one country after another, after another, after another, including close allies of the US, all started to impose their own sanctions, banking sanctions, sports sanctions, cultural sanctions, all these things. And eventually the pressure got so great that the US allowed the anti-apartheid movement here, which was then led by the Black Caucus of the Congress and the Black churches and the students, to win, to get US sanctions against apartheid South Africa that set the stage for what the South Africans were then doing to overthrow their own system of apartheid. We know it works because we saw it work. The difference is we don't have that decade to fight for it. We need to do all those things and more because now we are facing a genocide. So I end with that is our challenge. We have a model of how it can work using what the South Africans have showed us about challenging international institutions that once were thought to be only accessible to the white colonial countries, the US and Canada and Europe. They're the ones that get to use these institutions. The South Africans said, you know what? So do we. That's our job, is to say, so do we. We people get to use them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Professor Whitson.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. This is quite an event. It was a wonderful first panel, and I'm going to try to make this equally interesting. I'm going to speak today on the topic U.S. policy and the Greater Israel Project. What's the relationship? And I do have one of my books is on the Greater Israel Project, For the Land and the Lord, Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel, which is actually the Institute of Palestine Studies translated into Arabic, and I saw that it is in the library in Arabic. So it goes back to my work in the 80s. Where did this project come from? How did it achieve such enormous influence in Israel? And what's relationship to U.S. policy? I want to make a couple of points first. One is that the Greater Israel Project, which emphasizes, well, I'm a stamp collector, and I specialize I'm a cartophilatelist, which is not a perversion. It's actually a specialty of, I'm interested in maps on stamps. I collect hundreds of stamps that have maps of countries on them. Israel is the only country that I know of, and there might be another one, that I don't have a stamp from it that shows the map of the country. Because they never want to say exactly what the map is. That idea that the map should be enormous, relatively enormous, is the Greater Israel. That whatever Israel was created as a state in 48 and then 49, the UN borders or the 49 armistice lines are certainly not enough because they don't have the central core areas of biblical where the Israelites lived in biblical times. And that's the mission. Okay, that's what Greater Israel is. In the West Bank, there's of course a central element in that, but so is Gaza. Something to settle and keep under Jewish sovereignty the entire land of Israel. That's the Greater Israel Project. That is not the same as Zionism. Zionism had a lot of different versions of it. In the mainstream version, until after the 67, especially after the 73 war, was a small Israel that would have a small enough Arab minority that you could front it as a liberal democracy. That was the idea, a Jewish state that could credibly, to many people in the world, front as a Jewish democracy. The Greater Israel idea is much more ambitious and much more difficult to fit into the Middle East, even in theory. Now, I say that this was not what Zionism had to become, but it's one of the worst versions of what Zionism could have become. And one of the reasons it became that is U.S. policy, even though U.S. policy was never designed to do this. It's as I'm going to show you, is an unintended consequence of U.S. policies driven by other considerations. The degree to which the United States policy toward Israel is weird, which is in statistical terms 3 to 4 standard deviations from what it is in almost any other policy in relationship to what the world thinks, is evident in how the United States behaves at the UN, where, as you may know, and I'm going to read here from a draft of the book that was mentioned. This is a book that is not out yet. We're still writing it, but we're making good progress. I'm writing it with an investigative journalist, Eli Clifton, on the Israel lobby. The tentative title is "Easy to Move: America in the Grip of Israel's Lobby." From its founding in 1946 through October 2025, the United States cast 95 vetoes of draft Security Council resolutions. A clear majority of these American vetoes, 55 out of 95, were against draft resolutions that criticized Israeli policies. In recent decades, the pattern has become even more extreme. Between 1995 and 2017, the United States cast 14 negative votes against draft UNSC resolutions. All but one of these were critical of Israel for its policies toward Palestinians. In each case, the United States was the sole vote in opposition to the resolution, and therefore the only factor preventing its adoption. In 2024 and 2025, the U.S. vetoed 10 draft resolutions calling for a ceasefire in the war on Gaza. The singularity of American adherence to Israeli positions is just as apparent in the UN General Assembly, where a trend over years has shown that Israel is much, much less likely to vote with the majority of UNGA members. But the United States now votes with Israel 94% of the time in the UNGA, which is so. What explains this bizarre? Oh, there's another way to illustrate this is a little more fun. Since 1995, the House and the Senate have been jointly addressed. This is a big deal for a foreign leader to address a joint session of Congress. It's been done since 1995, 37 times. 5 of those 37 were Israeli leaders. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has addressed the Congress of those 5 4 times. He surpasses Winston Churchill, who's the only leader to have done so on 3 occasions. But that's not the most interesting part of this that illustrates just how far the United States is from the rest of the world. When Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the U.S. Congress on March 3rd, 2015, his 42-minute speech was interrupted 38 times, 23 of which were standing ovations. Indeed, more than 1/4 of the time at the rostrum consisted of applause by the congressional audience. One commentator described the response on Capitol Hill as follows: if there's one word to describe Congress's response, it would be ecstatic, in the drug-addicted sense. A bit too ecstatic. verging on the delirious, maniacal almost. The reception was similar in 2024, though the number of Democrats present was significantly reduced. Netanyahu's speech of 53 minutes was interrupted no less than 82 times by applause. And let me tell you, sitting through that speech and counting those was not the most pleasant hour of my life. It was interrupted no less than 82 times by applause, including 56 standing ovations, thus averaging more than one standing ovation per minute. So I want to draw your attention to an odd fact, even odder than that. There are two issues in international affairs in which the United States stands 3 to 4 standard deviations from the rest of the world. One of them is Israel. What is the other one?
Israel. Used to be
Cuba, where the United States and Israel vote for a boycott every October against the rest of the world. Now, this is interesting. What could explain two issues where the substance is actually the opposite, and the United States votes against the rest of the world? Gee, what could explain that? These are the two issues where you have a single issue, very important domestic lobby operating in the United States: Cuba lobby and the Israel lobby. So to me, the debate over whether it's in national interest, it's shared values, no. The thing that drives this weird American policy is internal domestic politics. Now, George Washington anticipated this problem. George Ball and his son, when they wrote their book, Passionate Attachment, drew attention to this. When the founding fathers put together the Constitution, they first thought they could get one that honored the idea that people would put their private interests aside and just go for the public good. That was Madison's first idea, and he realized that was not going to work because nobody would do that. So he came up with the opposite idea. Okay, we can't get rid of faction. We have to utilize faction. So we're going to make a government in which everybody is out for themselves. And by doing that, they'll all countervail each other, and nothing will get done that's really bad, because nobody will allow anybody else to take their goodies from them. That's a system of government that resulted. Washington said after two terms, and he's leaving, and he sees the situation internationally in which there's a fair number of people in the United States who are all for the French Revolution and anti-British. And of course, there are people in the United States who are very pro-British, but Washington was worried about the passionate attachment of Americans to this French Revolution. And he said, look, in our system of government, this is very dangerous. I don't care what you're attached to. No American citizen should be permanently hostile or permanently in love with another foreign country, because circumstances change. And there's no countervailing influence, because nobody has and that will distort U.S. policy over time. Well, until the Gettysburg Address, that was probably the most honored and admired message from a U.S. statesman in American history, and it's still up there. And he was unbelievably correct. Now, that means that we have to understand why the Greater Israel Project, we have to trace it to unintended consequences. Because what happens is that a president, whether that president is Truman or Ford or Carter or Bush 1 or Obama, and I've written a piece in Middle East Journal in 2021 called the Peace Process Carousel, the Israel Lobby and the Failure of American Diplomacy, which shows over time how these presidents who tried to deal in some way with the Palestinian problem go through a cycle, every one of them. First, they come into office and they say, well, I got a good idea for how we can get a comprehensive peace based on 242 and 338. We have the Soviets involved. And that's true of Nixon. It's true, true of Nixon, true of Ford, true of Carter, true of Obama in the first term. And every time they go through the same thing, they have this idea about opportunities, and they take an initiative, moratorium on settlements, or the Carter's Camp David. And then they get blowback from the lobby and they retreat. And then their domestic advisor says, wow, are you in trouble? You're not going to get reelected. You've got to apologize. You've got to compensate. And then after the retreat is the compensation phase, where you give Israel much, much more than they ever had in terms of U.S. commitments, for example, not to talk to the PLO. That was part of the compromise, the compensation phase in the Ford situation. And you end up with a deeper hole than American policy is in. It inherits the commitments and the requirements that the Israelis were able to extract from the compensation phases, thanks to the lobby's power in the last go-round. And now, in the question period, we can talk about what this Trump iteration is, but I just draw your attention to the fact that if Obama was reduced to trying not to get peace, but just to get a temporary pause in settlement, and he was willing to pay $38 billion to try to do it, now an American administration is reduced not to making peace, not to getting a settlement moratorium, but just to stop a genocide, or at least slow it down. You see what I mean by how over time, now, why do I say that this had something to do with the Greater Israel Project? And that's what I go into this in my Paradigm Lost book, which came out in Arabic recently and was translated into Hebrew. Paradigm Lost, from two-state solution to one-state reality. I don't do research on the two-state solution anymore. That's gone. I do research on the dynamics of what is a one-state reality. And in that context, we can talk about what the Gaza war is also. But let me return to my main question, which is, so what is the relationship between the Greater Israel Project and the unintended consequences of U.S. policy? How is that possible? Well, from an American president's point of view, ideologically, you generally never wanted to push this outcome, but you ended up doing it for reasons that, you know, Hamilton Jordan comes to you and say, you're going to lose the election for sure unless you do this. Look at this study I just done, or the equivalent of Hamilton Jordan in whatever administration you're in. And so you do it and you say, and you apologize, usually write a letter to Sadat and say, I'm so sorry, I couldn't do what I said I was going to do, but when I'm reelected, I really will. That's almost a quote from Ford's autobiography, and it's the same thing that Carter wrote to Sadat. Sadat must be just rolling his eyes both times. Here's what happens. In Israel, there's arguments between the left and the right, between versions of Zionism. Should Israel compromise with the Palestinians and with the world, get out of most or all of the territories, even though it's painful, even though those are actually ours because for historical reasons or God gave them to us, but we're going to get punished by the United States eventually, and we're going to fight endless wars. And the right that says, these are ours, and the United States is never going to punish us. We can have the United States behind us, get all that aid, and keep the territories, and the hell with the Palestinians. So you had a war between those positions. And over again, U.S. support that was unfailing and never significantly critical, never, I said, the first Bush, for a brief moment, Bush-Baker was, and we can go into that also in the question period, but because the United States proved over and over again that Yossi Sarid and Shulamit Aloni and Chaim Ramon and Yossi Beilin and all the moderate Israeli leaders that could have been prime minister were all wrong. That those who pandered to the most extreme fantasies inside of Israel were the ones who could win elections. And that moved the Israeli political system way over to the right from what it would have been. It's not because the United States wanted that to happen, but that's not usually how politics works anyway. Politics works normally, mostly through unintended consequences, not only. But it's not sufficiently understood how America, which did not want this outcome, even the Israel lobby didn't want this outcome, although many who are running the Israel lobby today are in love with this Greater Israel Project. But they just wanted, no, Israel shouldn't be pressured. It should make its own decisions. But as we see, when the United States creates a cocoon that protects Israeli democracy, protects Israel from any consequence of policies that are going to bring the world and itself endless pain 20 years, 30 years later. That's what you get. You get a change in the political center of gravity in a polity like Israel. That leads me to my conclusion, which is that the biggest problem in the Middle East is American domestic politics. And you cannot analyze American colonialism or American empire or American policy without understanding how what is a marginal issue for most Americans and for most presidents ends up, because of the Madisonian system we have and the flaw in it that George Washington identified, we cannot ignore when we're looking at what happens in the Middle East, what the calculations of American politicians are in the United States. And in that context, the changes that are in the wind that may presage more change in the future are of enormous consequence. But as my co-author and I also note, every single book on the Israel lobby, the critical books, including the Mearsheimer and Walt book, end by saying things have changed. The lobby's not as strong as it used to be. And in the next few years, you're going to see it. Every single book ends that way. So we are a little afraid of entering our book that way, but we are still working on the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Got young people this time. We've got young people.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am going to pick up where Ian left off. But first, in an audience like this, I just want to acknowledge what I'm sure is the pain that you're feeling, and the sadness and the depression and the anger and the rage. I feel like there is very little space for us to grieve and mourn the suffering that has been underway in the past 2 years in the most heinous, outrageous way, but also for many decades. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we are suffering and mourning collectively. And I appreciate all of you for being here and being resilient, despite what I know you're feeling inside. There isn't a single person that I've talked to who isn't active in this space, who hasn't looked into my eyes and told me how depressed and sad they are. But we're still here, and thank you for being here. And I guess this is what Samud is about, and this is what the people in Gaza are teaching us every day. You know, you've just heard two of the best analysts and writers describing the very bleak reality we're facing and analyzing why we're in that bleak reality. And what I'd like to try to do is to leave you all with a sense of hope, because hope is work and hope is a practice. And we have to lean in and take advantage of every thread of hope that is appearing before us. And the book that I've written with my colleague, Michael Omerman, really demands not just a lot of hope from its readers, but a lot of imagination. On the American policy front, and recognizing the past books that have said, but things are finally changing. I do believe that one of the unintended consequences of the Israeli genocide and its voracious, apparently never satisfied desire for greater Israel and greater Palestinian lands and water and resources and food and culture is the backlash that we're seeing not just around the world, but in the United States. Starting with the globe, I think it's very clear and indisputable that the people of the world stand with Palestine, and the people of the world stand with Palestine now more than they have probably since the anti-colonial movement of the late 60s and early 70s, such that the youth now today who probably had not uttered the word Palestine before October 7. Now it is the number one issue on their minds. It has even apparently superseded climate change, which I think had animated the young generation and was sort of the central issue, if not, racism and issues of diversity and police violence here in the United States. But globally, Palestine and Palestinians have captured not just the minds of the world, but the hearts. And I don't think there is any more powerful, motivating, politically motivating, activist motivating factor than capturing people's hearts. So to begin with, that is tremendously hopeful and hope-inspiring, because whatever power is being exercised now increasingly relies not on people's hearts, because Israel and its lobbyists have lost people's hearts, but on oppression. Whereas the Israel and its lobby could rely on its hasbara and its trips for members of Congress or American community leaders to Israel to somehow woo them into the Israeli dream. Now the Israel lobby relies on force, relies on sanctions, relies on expulsions, relies on firing, relies on terminating, relies on canceling, and enforces support for Israel through oppression. And I don't think that's a very good formula for buying the support of the American people on a long-term basis. Globally, as I mentioned, the international support for Palestinians has been reflected in more concrete actions than we have seen for many, many decades, when just a few years ago we were being told no one cares about Palestine, no one cares about Palestinians, the Abraham Accords are here, we can just pretend the Palestinians are not there. But what we've seen, in fact, is over a dozen countries, including significantly the second and third largest providers of weapons to Israel, Germany and Italy, suspending or dramatically limiting arms transfers to Israel. We have seen over a dozen countries end their diplomatic relations with Israel, or suspend them, or withdraw their ambassadors, or expel Israeli ambassadors. We have seen global civil society and sporting and arts and cultural organizations adopt a policy of boycott and exclusion of one sort or another against Israelis and Israeli officials. We have seen Israelis finding it difficult to travel to many places in the world because not only are they facing investigation, arrest, but also just revulsion. The disdain and contempt that global citizens have for Israelis who support the Israeli regime, first and foremost Israeli soldiers. And given there's mandatory conscription, that basically means every Israeli at some point or another has either served or continues to serve in a reserve capacity. It's a global isolation that Israelis have never really felt before. That sort of change in global ethos, while the United States the US government is alone in its support for Israel and its strong support for Israel, has also impacted Americans in the United States. And I have never thought I would see in my lifetime American political candidates running for office on the explicit promise, on a campaign advertisement, that they don't take money from AIPAC and won't take money from AIPAC. Whereas even those who might be sympathetic to Palestine and Palestinians and be critical of Israel before would kind of just keep that as quiet as possible. Now we have candidates, young candidates, who are finding that that is a good formula, a good approach to win. And no one, I think, can reasonably underestimate the reality that the election of Mayor Zohran Mamdani in New York was specifically predicated and built on his very strong position in favor of Palestinian freedom and in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That actually mattered to voters. And I think that the conclusion that people are increasingly beginning to reach, even if they don't care about Palestine, is that supporting Palestine and opposing Israel is a signal of integrity. It's a calling card that says, you know, I'm not bought, because if I was bought, if I had no integrity, I would be receiving money from AIPAC. So even if you don't care about Palestine or Palestinians, this is a sign of my being someone of integrity and principle. And I think that that is something that is beginning to sway voters. And that's something I hope we will all be leaning into. And I know we at Dawn, my organization, have been leaning into, and other important organizations have been leaning into. But let's celebrate and push for that. Because I think the second thing that's happening is that, again, not centering Palestinians and Palestinian suffering necessarily, but certainly inspired by that, even Americans in the conservative party, in the conservative movement, are now having a tear down, knockdown fight that is seriously dividing the Republican Party in a way we have not seen before, not under Bush, not under the first Trump administration. And they are having a much more honest and robust, and in some cases pretty vicious, fight within the Republican Party about Israeli influence, pro-Israel influence and control in the Republican Party and in the US government. And the numbers of people who are supporting the positions of people like Tucker Carlson and Tom Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ron Paul is increasing, not decreasing. And the sort of drama you all saw, and those of you who follow it at the Heritage Foundation, that may have been about, on the surface, Tucker Carlson and free speech and Nick Fuentes. But beneath that, I think, is this tug of war about whether or not the pro-Israel lobby is going to control the Republican Party just as it has controlled the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party and its leadership have their head in the sands, and they're hiding, and they're refusing to even discuss the topic, as they recently refused to do at the Democratic National Convention. But as they're seeing in the ballot box, they're being punished for this. Chuck Schumer's being punished for this. Hakeem Jeffries is being punished for this. Pelosi is being punished for this. And sooner or later, they will have to choose whether they want to be elected or whether they want to choose their donors and lose their office. But you know, that kind of friction is incredibly important because ultimately, I think what explains the control of the Israel lobby comes down to a very, very basic concept that I think can be summarized in one word: corruption. Israel and its support is paid for. It is not authentic. It does not reflect any strategy. It does not reflect any principle. It merely reflects the corruption of the US government. And now, increasingly, the surrender of American rights and freedoms, our freedom of speech, our freedom of assembly, in order to preserve and protect continued US support for Israel. That's why we've seen the shutdown of protests on campuses. That's why we've seen the takeover, very expensive takeover of CBS News and the installation of pro-Israel mouthpieces, because they have no other recourse left other than to exert sort of repressive, suppressive control to keep America and Americans on side. And, you know, either the United States and its own constitution and democratic freedoms will go down on the altar of pro-Israel support, or Americans who increasingly see that the price of support for Israel isn't just the ruthless slaughter of Palestinians, it's our own constitution, our own freedom, our own democratic mode of government. And so the stakes are much higher for Americans now than they were before. And that's a good thing, because the mask is off and we can all see it for what it is. And I hope we can lean into it. I don't know if I've gone on to you. Yeah. I will segue that into say that we don't know what's going to happen. The world is rife with black swans. I bet you most of you here did not anticipate or predict the election of Donald Trump the first time around. I bet you nobody here would have predicted the election of Zohran Mamdani. In fact, we would have all bet high stakes and money that he would never break 5% or something like that. We didn't predict the Arab uprisings that toppled numerous regimes in the Arab world. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not predicted. The fall of the Soviet Union was predicted. And we must trust and lean into the black swans of humanity that produce good things, not bad things. And we must see in the current moment a moment of opportunity that has been paid for by tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza who've given their lives, by tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank who continue to resist, and on their backs, we now have an opportunity where we see a moment of hope and change. What my book tries to offer with Michael Omerman is a new blueprint for such a peace, a new blueprint to end the conflict that ends and breaks with the failed Oslo process. We start with recognizing the reality that I and others have contributed to all of us seeing, which is the one-state apartheid reality, and we build from there. And what we count on is in a moment when Israeli Jews and Palestinians, but particularly Israeli Jews, because they have the power, say uncle, and imagine that they will choose a transition, choose a change, just like white South Afrikaners at one point said uncle. I mean, you can sanction them all they want. They could have chosen to try to maintain their apartheid rule, but they didn't. They didn't want to be globally isolated anymore. They didn't want their tech companies to flee to Cyprus. They didn't want to be able to not travel to Europe without facing revulsion and expulsion and even arrest. And so what we're trying to build with the plan that we're putting forward is a dramatic break from the failed approach of Oslo in two critical respects. And the plan, and I hope you buy the book to read more, envisions the establishment of a transitional government between the river and the sea that prioritizes, first of all, ending Israeli crimes of apartheid and occupation ahead of questions of governance. One of the failures of the past approaches is because they have said that governance must be resolved first, one state or two states or demarcation of borders before Israeli crimes end. We reject that approach because ending Israeli crimes, ending any crimes, cannot be conditioned on what a counterparty or anyone else does or doesn't do. A criminal must end their crimes unconditionally, as the UN General Assembly has ordered Israel to do, has failed to meet its deadline. And second of all, reserves the question of ultimate governance at the end of a 3-year transition process to the people of Israel-Palestine between the river and the sea to democratically decide what they want their future governance to look like. But we basically convert the apartheid one-state reality, even if we fail, into a democratic one-state reality. And we do not allow the unelected, unaccountable, corrupt representatives, so-called representatives of the Palestinian people in the Palestine Authority, nor the criminal representatives of the Israeli government who've been indicted by the International Criminal Court to make decisions on behalf of Palestinians or Israelis, nor do we collapse Palestinians and Israeli Jews into one single block or identity such that their identity as Palestinians or Israelis is the only thing that matters. No, we treat everyone as a human being that's entitled to a secret vote on the secret ballot to decide if they want a different form of governance, one state or two states. We built and developed this plan after researching to find whether those who advocated for one state had a plan. They don't. Whether those who advocated for a binational solution had a plan, or a confederation had a plan, land for peace, land for all. Nobody had a plan for how to get there. And so that's why we built this plan as what we hope will be a contribution to policymakers, to Israelis, to Palestinians who currently don't have an off-ramp. We've heard why the Gaza plan, whatever it is a lot of things, but is not a plan for the future of Israel and Palestine to live in peace. And we think that that is missing in the policy discussions, that part of the reason we are at an impasse, such that the Saudis and the French and the British and those who've recently decided to recognize the state of Palestine have been at an impasse, is because there is no off-ramp. There is no plan to replace Oslo. And that's what I'm trying to put forward, and I hope you will give it a chance and give it a read. Thank you.
I would like to thank all of our speakers today for their illuminating presentations. I think they have shed much light on the situation. I would like to ask one question of each of you. Professor Lustick actually mentioned about President George Washington, who warned against inveterate hatred or compassion towards other nations. He said, any country, if we become either very hateful of that country, or if we become we love that country, this is going to lead to conflict. It may lead to wars. And to a certain extent, the United States, many leaders, presidents respected that up until maybe part of early 20th century or late even 19th century. I would like to ask you about the lobby, the Israeli lobby. How was it able to increase its power, its authority? I mean, if we go back a little bit, we see what, for example, President Eisenhower, during the 1956 attacks on Egypt, the Israelis challenged him and threatened, in fact, that they would undermine him. But yet he took a tough line. We saw presidents such as Reagan, even in '82 in Beirut. We saw a number of other presidents, even George Bush Sr., when he stopped the 10 billion. But now there seems to be a shift in public opinion, which Phyllis mentioned, as well as Sarah. How do you think the power of the lobby through your research, how has it increased, and what could be done now? To what extent could this shift bring about a change in American policy?
But you could write a book about that. And I'd say a couple of things, not to give an entire answer. Let's look at Eisenhower, because that he really did get furious at the Israelis, not necessarily more furious than many other presidents were, but he actually acted on it. And he told Ben-Gurion that he had to get out of not only Sinai, but he had to get out of Gaza, or else the United States would just not send any more ships to Eilat. And all of a sudden, American Jewish contributions to Israel will be tax deductible. And boom, I mean, that was enough to do it. One of the things he was caught in, Eisenhower was in the midst of, was the Hungary had just been invaded by the Soviet Union. So we were in a Cold War with the Soviets, and it was an imperative, Cold War imperative, to act this way. Now, he also had a much, much weaker lobby at that time. The lobby really didn't become anything like what it is until after '67. But what I want to point out is that once the Cold War disappeared, presidents after 1990, let's say, presidents lost the ability to say, yes, I'll suffer domestically, but I won't suffer so much because I'll say that I had to tell the Israelis to stop the war because otherwise it would hurt, it would endanger America. We might get into a Cuban Missile Crisis type thing with the Soviets. So we can go to DEFCON 3 and we can get the Israelis to stop their attack on the Egyptian Third Army. But the United States has been able to use the Cold War, just the discipline of the Cold War, in order to finesse the problem of Israeli lobby oppressor. Once the Cold War is gone, it was all of a sudden Biden, who was already ideologically aligned with the Israelis, did not have a Cold War imperative that he could. We didn't even have a peer adversary in the Middle East that he could invoke. oh, well, look, I didn't want to pressure Israel, but I had to because of American geopolitical interests and the American people will understand. That was gone. So when I realized that in Time magazine early in the war, I said, they asked me, when will the war end? Next week, in a month. This was back in November. I said, no, this war is, I can tell you exactly when the war will end. The war will end only and exactly when the United States tells Israel has to end. And if we consider this an end, that's exactly what happened. But it took 2 years, which even I didn't realize would take that long. Why did it take so long for the United States? Now, one reason is there is no Cold War, and we have a completely transactional president who has his own functional equivalent of the Cold War, which is how much money am I going to make this way as opposed to that way. So that's one answer to your question. But another answer is in terms of the trajectory of the lobby. I hate to do this, but let's point to the NRA. What do we know about the NRA? This is very important for things that have said. The NRA espouses policies that legislatively are always successful. And yet public opinion polls all show that their policies are unpopular. So it doesn't, so what we learn from that is that a lobby can succeed despite public opinion that is completely opposed to what it wants. So how is that possible? It's possible because the lobbies can use money. And the Israel lobby has changed. It used to be under AIPAC in its heyday, a kind of grassroots organization that mobilized money from small givers. Now it's plutocratically manipulated by a small number of people who are in touch and sympathetic with the Greater Israel Project. And so it's a different kind of lobby, but it's one that still can also, I will now stop here, used to be that the lobby could argue in favor of Israeli policies, especially go to a college campus and debate policies and expect maybe to win some of those debates. Now, Israeli Hasbara has changed because they know there are no arguments that can be won with informed audiences in the United States to defend Israeli policies. So Israel Hasbara and the lobby have shifted completely to don't allow argument, use anti-Semitism accusations to prevent argument, to cancel. And that's something which may not be able to last forever, given public opinion. But I always remind you, look at the NRA when you think about what the next stage of the struggle with the lobby is going to be like.
Thank you. My next question will be to Phyllis. What I would like to ask you is basically, it's in part related to what Professor Lustick has been talking about, but where do you see, or how do you see actually, if you look ahead, what form of transactional and transnational as well, collaboration, whether it's legal, political, social, do you believe will hold the greatest potential for advancing peace and accountability here and internationally, but peace in the region?
It's a good question. Let me just say one thing about the lobby first, which is I agree with virtually all of what you said, but I think the question of the Cold War is far more important. Because if we look at the period from 1967 on, which was really the beginning of the so-called special relationship between the US and Israel, that special relationship took form in the context of the 1967 war when the Pentagon took the initiative and looked at that war and said, wow, these guys are good. They just trumped 5 Arab armies, which was partly mythology. There weren't 5 Arab armies that actually fought in that war. But nonetheless, the Israeli army had acquitted itself very well in terms of what it wanted to do to occupy the last bits of historic Palestine. And the position of the Pentagon was essentially, we could do business with these people. We're in the middle of the Cold War, and we're fighting against Soviet penetration, as it was called, in the Middle East throughout that period. And the role of Israel was a very important one strategically and militarily, not just in the region, but in Latin America, in Africa, places like Angola and Mozambique, providing weapons, in Guatemala, in Chile, and in all of these situations, Israel was a very important cat's paw of U.S. interest, U.S. intervention, in other parts of the world as well. At the end of the Cold War, we did see a huge shift away from the reliance on that strategic interest. And it was then that the lobby for that 10-year period, the post-Cold War era, it was called, when we thought there would be a peace dividend, all that, that meant that the lobby really stood up at that point. The lobby became much more important. And then when we had, after 9/11, when suddenly the global war on terror shapes US foreign policy, the strategic interest of Israel, providing intelligence in this so-called anti-terrorism war that the US was waging all over the region, becomes very important again. So in that period, the strategic interest becomes less important, more important, and the lobby is less so. So there, in my view, there's always been this up and down between whether the strategic interest at given times and the lobby for the political reasons at given times is more important. I don't think we can really say one or the other across the board. It's different at different periods. On the question of the international collaborations, I think this is what we're already seeing in this period of the genocide. And the ICJ part of it was perhaps the first visible example of that. You know, a lot of people around the world were so inspired by this idea of Israel being held accountable in a court on its violations of this existing law, and that it was being brought by the South Africans, by the Rainbow Nation, who had overthrown apartheid in their own right. There was this extraordinary sense of people around the world feeling connected to that. I know a lot of people who got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to watch it at the hearing in The Hague when the South African team came in to argue. And the South African team was a global team. They had lawyers from Ireland, from Palestine, from a bunch of different countries, deliberately, not because they didn't have enough good South African lawyers, but because that was part of what they were doing, and it worked in that sense. And then we've seen the rise of not new movements. These movements have been there for a long time, but we saw a new level of visibility in these movements and a new level of connections between them. So that during this genocide, the connections between people that were mobilizing in the US and people mobilizing in South Africa, in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, in a number of countries around the world, those relationships began to consolidate far more than they had before. And I think that what I ended with when I spoke earlier is really the key to this, that this model of using these international law issues, you know, on a legal sense, we saw that in California I can't remember if it was just before or just after the arguments in the South Africa case in The Hague. The Center for Constitutional Rights and the National Lawyers Guild and others brought a case in US domestic courts against Biden and Blinken for violating the Convention Against Genocide for complicity. And there was an extraordinary moment in the federal court in California where the judge said, after several days of trying to figure out his opinion, and then he read parts of the opinion from the bench, and he said, because of the, I'm forgetting the legal strategy that basically says that only the executive branch gets to determine it's a political question, but there's a particular part of it, yeah, that only the president essentially and Congress have the right to engage in foreign policy, and courts don't. He said, for that reason, I have to throw this out. It doesn't survive the motion to dismiss. But I want to make clear that what I have heard from the witnesses in my courtroom show me that without a doubt, these actions by Israel constitute genocide, that participation in them. And he read this extraordinary opinion, which has, that has never happened before. So on a legal basis, that's happening. But on the political basis, what we're seeing is people around the world fighting to engage in these same kinds of sanctions, even though we know that every country in the world could say, we're imposing an arms embargo on Israel. And if the US continued, that wouldn't help. It wouldn't matter. But people are saying, yeah, it does matter. So you have in Ireland, you have a huge mobilization to stop the use of Shannon Airport for US planes that are bringing weapons to Israel, and they routinely use that. The military uses it for refueling. And they not only stopped that, but they passed a law saying it would be illegal. Then it turned out that very clever people in Ireland, that they were violating their own law because they were so determined to continue this relationship with the military. They had arranged a very clever routine where pilots would radio ahead to Shannon as they approached the Irish coast, saying, we've got an emergency, we need to make an emergency landing. And by law, when there's an emergency, you have to let the plane land, right? So the planes would land, and it's like, well, as long as you're on the ground, we may as well refuel your plane. And they would take off. But it broke in the Irish press. We met with the Irish ambassador at the UN about this to challenge him on it. And he burst out laughing and he said, I see you guys have been well briefed on this. And we said, well, we take this seriously. This is not just about making the statements. This is about making it happen. And he said, well, we're working on it. We're trying to figure this out. The South Africans as well. There is still South African coal being shipped to Israel. The South African government is saying, we don't have a law that can stop it at this point. And we're like, well, make one, pass a law, whatever, that this is not, you're doing great other stuff, but that one's not okay. So there's this kind of collaboration among movements to pressure their own governments to make these things happen. And all of this brings more pressure on the US. So that when Germany announced we're going to stop sending weapons, that was enormous because the US provides about 70% of the weapons to Israel, 28% is Germany, 2% is Italy. And we don't know, and I don't think Germany is actually going to stop sending. But even making that statement had a huge impact on other European governments who could now say, well, if even Germany, for God's sakes, who have always been the one that refused to even criticize Israeli actions, if they're actually saying they're going to stop sending weapons, well, we can do that too. So this does spread in that way between governments and the movements. And then finally, you have an organization that's emerging now, like the Hague Group, which started as an initiative of civil society that pulled together a few progressive, generally former leaders in a few countries to sign on to a very good statement. Some of us thought it wasn't going to go much beyond that, but it has, partly because the leaders in Colombia and South Africa said, okay, we're going to take this on and make this a real diplomatic effort, which is still very closely linked with civil society mobilizations. So all of that is happening now on a much bigger scale than we've ever seen, the collaboration between governments and social movements. And it's because the governments are turning against Israel. They don't want to be very overt about it because they don't want to challenge the US, because they don't want to deal with tariffs, they don't want to deal with Trump, they don't want to deal with having their fishermen ships blown up. But they do recognize that this is not something they want to support. So it has changed dramatically.
Thank you. I have a question talking about what enforcement mechanisms maybe could be used now to prevent the collapse of the ceasefire. Many people are talking about the ceasefire is about to collapse and that we might see a new Kushner plan. Anyway, but how can international legal accountability be integrated into future ceasefire agreement? And what role do you think US policy should be playing, especially to what extent also is public opinion? You mentioned a couple of very interesting points, especially the role of some people within MAGA, within the Republican Party, Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and others. How do you think their position, is it likely to be more effective or less effective than what we're seeing in terms of the national stand by students, by the different human rights organizations? So how do you see this?
Yeah, a lot of questions there, but let me just start with the latter one. I think that the debate that's happening within the Republican and MAGA movement is tremendously important. And it's a real battle for the hearts of the MAGA base. And I think for people like Tucker, the principal issue is sovereignty, American democratic sovereignty, and the usurpation of that sovereignty by the Zionist billionaires increasingly small number, not representing any broad grassroots movement in the United States, but merely the corruption of very wealthy and powerful individuals that is supporting, transforming our country into an authoritarian state. And I think that it's not either or, it's just a collection of important movements that are happening in the progressive movement, in the conservative movement, and we see the results in the polls. The challenge, of course, is the disconnect between what the American people want and what the American government does, and that ties to the inherent corruption of American foreign policy by foreign influence and foreign interests. And it's not just Israel, it's just that's where the stakes are highest right now. American policy on Saudi Arabia is something that the Saudi government has bought and paid for by corrupting American officials. And, you can go down the line of the many places where the U.S. doles out favors in the Middle East and know that that's not something the American people are choosing, but it's something the American government is doing. On accountability, I just want to turn to specific examples of efforts that are underway. Phyllis mentioned the lawsuit that was brought in California under the Genocide Convention, and predictably, sadly, that failed because of the political question doctrine. My organization, Dawn, has also brought a lawsuit against the State Department. We have a hearing for the government's motion to dismiss later this month, and it's here in DC, and I will share information about that hearing, and I hope people will come and sit and watch this important discussion. We didn't bring it under an international law. We brought our lawsuit under something called the Administrative Procedures Act, which is the only law that is available to basically force the government to abide by laws passed by Congress. So one of the laws passed by Congress is the so-called Leahy Law Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, which is a mandatory, non-waivable, non-discretionary law that says from Congress to the State Department, you may not, you must not, you may not, it is forbidden to provide military assistance to security forces of foreign governments that have been implicated in human rights abuses. So what our lawsuit contends is that the State Department has never abided by this law with respect to Israel. It has sanctioned thousands of foreign security force units to say, okay, well, we're giving foreign assistance to Nigeria, but this unit and this unit and this unit can't get any of it. That law has never been enforced, deliberately never been enforced with respect to Israel. And so we are suing on a very narrow ground, which is you violated the Procedures Act by refusing to abide by the Leahy Law. And that's the basis on which we're suing. We're not suing on the basis of international law. We, on behalf of Palestinian and Palestinian American plaintiffs, are suing the State Department for failing to abide by law. And there is precedent for Administrative Procedure Act lawsuits, even on something that's ostensibly a foreign policy question, ironically brought by, Israelis who wanted their child who was born in Israel, in Jerusalem rather, that the passport should say Israel and not Jerusalem, and that the State Department failed to abide by US law by not putting in Israel in the passport. And so again, that lawsuit was brought under the APA. We are obviously hopeful we will succeed and withstand the political question doctrine challenge, which is the number one way the government shields itself from challenges to its military aid and military assistance. But we'll see how that goes. The other thing we've done, and I think this is important for an international law perspective, is that in addition to submitting the dossiers of 40 Israeli officials and commanders for prosecution at the International Criminal Court for violations of the Rome Statute in the pending investigation in Palestine, We submitted in January a 200-page complaint against Biden, Blinken, and Austin for aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity in violation of the Rome Statute, not making us particularly popular with the Biden administration. But it's, I think, important to note that the ICC has prosecuted people more for aiding and abetting liability than the actual abuses, the underlying abuses themselves. And I think it's very important for us to underline, as I know that my colleagues have alluded, and I'm sure most of you know, is that the genocide would not be possible, the ongoing occupation and apartheid rule would not be possible, but for the US government. This is an American problem, first and foremost. We're here in America. We have to be focusing on the Americans. We are going to have very little influence with the Israelis directly, but we can and should have influence with the Americans. And I'll just close, I'm sorry for this long answer, that we are about to launch a campaign to go after American city and state officials who are buying Israel bonds. And we are going to be threatening them with lawsuits. I don't know how many we can actually bring, but we think the threat will be enough to say, again, that these purchases of Israel bonds violate state laws on fiduciary duty, that these are these unlawful, risky, financially risky, legally risky investments breach the fiduciary duty of these public officials, and they should not be buying Israel bonds and opening themselves up to legal and financial risk, given the downgrading of Israeli bonds and Israeli government-issued securities. So that's another tactic that we are hoping to pursue, because again, I think this is where we got to be fighting the fight here in the United States.
Thank you very much. We don't have much time left, but let's take a few questions. Please make your questions as concise as possible. Yes.
First of all, thank you for. First of all, thank you for this informative panel. I'm agreeing 100% with everything you said about the genocide, about what happened over there. But I feel that there is something missing. And what is missing is about Iran. I'm from Iran. I'm from a country that 120,000 people have been executed on the dream of the God. My own sister, she had 4 children, one of them. If in this discussion, if about the Palestine, about their interests, you don't consider the Iranian government on part, because Hamas is not Palestinian, choice. Hamas is a terrorist organization that has been, financed by the richest country in the world, is Iran. How do you see that? I mean, if you don't consider Iran in your discussion, you go to the wrong direction, because they are trying to say we represent Israel under the leadership of Israel. We are Muslim, and it's not true.
Oh, thank you. Who are you addressing this question to?
Not a question, he had a comment. We don't have to respond. Yeah, that was a comment. We don't have to.
That's all right. That's all right. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to address it. First of all, there isn't a single government in the Middle East that is not a serial, systematic human rights abuser. I wish Iran was the only abusive government in the region. I wish Iran was the only government that was jailing and torturing dissidents and activists, carrying out executions. I assure you that its neighbor, Saudi Arabia, is exercising no less brutality and cruelty towards its population. I wish Iran was the only government in the region that was supporting armed groups, whether you like them or you don't like them. The whole world knows that it is the UAE that is arming the RSF in Sudan, that is currently also carrying out a genocide, as numerous international law scholars were observing. As an American, My responsibility is for what my government does, first and foremost. And what my government is doing is arming and supporting many of these abusive regimes. Not Iran, fortunately, but my government is defending Saudi Arabia. And in fact, next week, the US will announce a security agreement to promise to risk the lives of American women and children, American soldiers, to go fight for the royal family and die for the royal family in Saudi Arabia. I need to stop that because that's my responsibility as an American. My government is arming and funding Israel, not Iran. So our responsibility here in the United States is for what our own government is doing and aiding and abetting and contributing to.
Palestine ambassador to Israel, Mark Haggerty, represents a significant sector of American society of Christian Zionist and evangelical churches. You spoke of the needle shifting in favor of Palestine. How do you see this needle shifting in the future?
Just briefly on that, I think I said that the role of the Christian Zionist lobby is a very important part of the pro-Israel lobby, and it has grown stronger in recent years. Organizations like CUFI, the Christians Uniting for Israel, people like John Hagee, and like the predominantly Jewish sector of the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC in particular, which has become not just about Israel, but about supporting a whole host of right-wing issues, both global and international and domestic. The evangelical right-wing Christian forces are expanding in that way too. It's not just about Zionism. It's not just about Israel. It's also about a number of important social issues domestically and globally. So I think that these are all component parts of a rising right wing that we're facing here in the United States and internationally. I think the good news is that there is in the Jewish community, there's been a much more visible and much, I would say, much stronger generational divide than is true among young evangelicals. But it is starting there too. You have a whole generation of young Jews now who are not growing up like when I grew up. If you identified as Jewish, you supported Israel. That was sort of all there was. There was no alternative identification. Now, young Jews that are, a couple generations younger than me are growing up saying, I want my identity to be that of social justice. It's not about Israel. It's not about any country. It's about social justice, particularly those who grew up in what they are now calling the justice generation, who came of age in the period of the George Floyd protests. In the evangelical community, I think that's not as strong, that generational shift, but it is beginning. There are some indications of it. There's a couple of new books that have come out recently about Christian Zionism in the US and challenging it. And I think that there are organizations within the Christian churches that are now taking on the issue of Christian nationalism, of which Zionism is a component of that kind of Christian nationalism, which is ultimately about racism and white supremacy. So organizations like the Repairers of the Breach, led by Reverend William Barber, are taking on the challenge to Christian nationalism, and Christian Zionism is a component of that. So there is that kind of challenge going on, but you're right to identify that as a serious issue.
Very cool. Yes.
My question actually goes to the panel, but also to you, Edmund, because you teach at Pepperdine, and we were talking. So my question goes for folks, this is specifically around the universities. We were talking before about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that Johnny Moore is now the Vice Chancellor of Pepperdine. And in the next panel, we're going to talk about repression, but I'm more interested in how we as civil society put pressure on universities when the people in power hold so much power. So whether it's the Vice Chancellor like Johnny Moore at Pepperdine, or all of these people who have investments or tied to these companies that are the puppeteers of this, and how the Israeli project fits into that, and then what we can do to put pressure to get people like Johnny Moore fired, but also just like more broadly the whole divestment campaign that was carried out.
You're putting your finger on a really important issue. I mean, at University of Wisconsin, University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere, you can see how the administrations of these universities responded to the Trump administration's pressures and the lobby's pressures by trying to make deals and by smothering dissent, by passing thickets of ridiculous rules that makes it almost impossible to organize spontaneous events of protest on Middle East issues, strangling Middle East programming because they're so afraid of what it would result in terms of bad publicity for potential donors. I think no one knows the exact solution to this, but what I want to point out is that the faculty and students are on one side, and the administrators are the ones who are trying to make deals with these extortionists. And the more publicity that can be put on that fact, that it's the administrators, not the students and faculty, that it's not that inside the classroom things are as exciting and as focused as they've always been. Letters to alumni magazines talking about how students actually feel as opposed to how the lobby and some of the press pretend that they feel. Reports from inside the classroom. That is the kind of thing that I think is most important. I would really love to see those letters in alumni magazines. But it is a really difficult problem. All I can say is that in general, faculties, and there's the AAUP chapters all over the country. American Association of University Professors are very active, very aggressive in this way. They have completely abandoned an old positions that they had that were being used by the lobby to protect Israel from BDS. AAUP has now basically shifted its position for some years now and is now very, very active on this and other related issues. So that's another address for you to go to.
We'll take one or two more questions. That's it. We don't have much time. Let's take one from here and we'll take one in the back there. Yeah,
Okay.
make it brief, please.
Yeah, very, very brief. Yeah, okay. So first, very small comment. The more we talk about Riviera in Gaza, I think about the gas field there, that for which Netanyahu already sold some shares to some of his friends.
Yes.
But my main question is, you talk about the lobby and the money that goes. So, and it is true that now the billionaires become trillionaires. So there is much more money invested in all of this, number one. Number two, there is another factor, which is the blackmail. So now, not just with Epstein and the story, which is not ended, actually now inflated again, but I'm thinking about 9/11, which is another thing to keep in mind. That's all.
No, I'll pass on that. I mean,
We'll take yeah.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much, Phyllis, Sarah, Dr. Lustick, and Dr. Ghareeb for this wonderful discussion today. So I want to ask, for those of us who do work in the think tank space and who do work in policy, how do you recommend, how would you approach pushing back on these harmful narratives, countering the advancement of the Abraham Accords, countering even the entertainment of normalization with Israel? How do we kind of build pressure from within?
Yeah, I mean, I would say flood the zone, do your jobs to keep the lunacy of American policy from a strategic perspective, from a legal perspective, from a moral perspective on the front burner, organize panels and talks. I don't think you will have much difficulty in finding speakers to articulate the problems of U.S. policy and its sort of failure to advance any strategic or positive interests for either the people of the region or the American people. The Council on Foreign Relations, which I'm a member of, recently organized a panel on Gaza. I think ostensibly on the Gaza humanitarian situation, which is how they brought the issue in. Yusuf Munayed, who I'm sure many of you know, Asla Bali, were two of the speakers. That panel only happened because the membership of the Council on Foreign Relations, including myself, several of us wrote a letter and repeatedly complained and complained and complained about the terrible programming that CFR had organized. One panel exclusively made up of pro-Israel Jews telling us about Gaza and the war. Another panel made up of Victoria Coates of the Heritage Foundation and some other new Republican right-wing think tanker telling us about how great the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was. But the members complained. And so as a result, we had an excellent panel on Gaza that was a formal part of the CFR presentation. Interestingly, another fight is brewing, and I'll let everyone know that CFR took the video of the panel down off from its website. No doubt because its own board members and donors started to scream and cry and yell when you had people actually speaking truth and facts. And so we're going to take up that fight with CFR next. But, you know, you got to be in it and you got to fight it and you got to be willing to make enemies of people who will, you know, try to punish you and silence you.
First of all, I'm in CFR also. I want to become a part of that. I think I know who's doing that. But I have a quick suggestion for you. One of the focuses of our book is on what I call the IHRA hoax. And people, it's a very complicated but very important story as to how this hoax came about and what it means. And what you, so your job is to constantly say, substantive engagement, substantive knowledge is what's important. All of these efforts to call people as anti-Semitic is just a cover. It's just a desperate attempt to smother and prevent discussion. And I want to give you one sentence. You know, Foucault said something very important. How could you vastly expand the amount of crime in a society without changing anyone's behavior? Simple, pass a different law that makes current behavior criminal. That's what the IHRA definition is, quote unquote, it's not really a definition, it does. It just makes things anti-Semitic, which completely aren't. It's not discovering all of a sudden an upsurge in anti-Semitism. So be careful. That's what you're going to be up against. Focus over and over again on substance, on knowledge, just as you suggested.
I agree with all of that both of my colleagues have said. I'm not a member of the CFR and probably never will be. I don't think anybody ever asked me to be. But I will say one other thing about think tanks, which is that most of them have what I believe to be a very cyclical approach to how you change policy, which is if we could just write the exact brilliant paper and get it on the desk of that person who's going to change the world. It doesn't work that way. Think tanks, if they're going to be relevant and progressive, need to be connected to movements. That's what my think tank has done since 1963, and I'm very proud of it. And we do some work with Congress, we do some work with, you know, people in positions of power on occasion when we have to, but it's not the main thing we do. We work with movements. We provide the information, we provide resources, we do teach-ins, we do speaking stuff, we write articles, we write in the mainstream press, we write in the progressive press. We do all those things. The most recent book that I wrote is for people in movements who know what side they're on, but they don't know the history, they don't know how to, you know, we're going on to Thanksgiving, you know, how are you going to talk with your crazy son-in-law that has all these weird ideas about Israel? Well, that kind of a book, you know, we write those kinds of books as much as we do, actually a lot more than we do academic books. So make think tanks part of movements. That's, I think, a better shot at how we're going to change the world.
We have one last comment.
Greedy.
Yeah.
I have to say this, I try to say this at every event such as this, where you guys have shown up and you've turned up. One of the problems we have in our community of peace lovers and supporters of human rights and democracy and supporters of Palestinian rights and freedom is we're cheap. We're not spending our own money to support these organizations. This stuff doesn't happen for free. The lights aren't on in here for free. The staff is not paid for free. And everybody here, I hope you'll look into my eyes briefly and promise me that you're going to make a donation to this organization that, you know, is not rolling in bucks. And we got to pay up. Make a donation. We have to actually spend the money. We don't have as much money, but we have to spend a lot more, and we're not doing it, not even close. So please, don't just show up, take out your pocketbooks, even if you're already a donor, and say, I'm going to help promote the cost of this conference. It takes money. So please, donate.
We had a couple of questions, if I saw one here, and I think I saw one in the back. Okay, yeah.
Hello, I had a question for Ms. Bennis. You touched a little bit on the Gaza rebuilding. Oh, sorry, can you hear me better? Okay. You touched a little bit on the Gaza rebuilding peace plan that's going on. And last night it was reported that Russia has introduced a competing UN proposal that has split the Security Council, and it does not include a board of peace. How should we understand Moscow's move as a strategic counterbalance to the United States, and how will this impact the region in terms of imperialism?
I was doing another briefing last night, so I didn't hear this news. So I don't know the details of what they put forward. I think that there is a great deal of anger among diplomats, and to the degree that people around the world know about these developments, towards what the U.S. is doing, and then trying to, late in the game, get the UN on board to endorse it. This is what the U.S. tried to do in Iraq 2 times. The first time, Bush Sr. succeeded. Bribes, threats, punishments of all the other countries, they got the UN endorsement to go to war. Tony Blair and George Bush Jr. didn't get it. And their announcement, which was made, interestingly, on the day of the biggest protests against the looming Iraq war that had ever taken place in the world, 15 million people in 800 cities around the world that day. In the middle of that set of protests, the U.S. announced, with the Brits, we're not any longer going to try and get a second resolution at the UN. And there was a moment, literally about 10 minutes, that we all thought, my God, maybe we won. Maybe these protests meant something. Maybe we're going to win this time. And then it became clear that what it meant was they are simply going to go ahead without UN imprimatur. And what happened was, for 8 months, the UN stood defiant, because the Security Council was not just about a veto. There were 6 members of the Security Council that were known as the uncommitted 6, that were elected members, not permanent members, had no veto. But if those 6 stuck together, they could prevent them from getting the requisite 9 votes in favor. And what that meant was, these were all countries, these were, see if I can do this, I used to know it right off, Chile, Mexico, Pakistan, Angola, Cameroon, Guinea. Got it. None of those countries could stand up to the US individually, but together, collectively, they did. The US press derisively called them the 6-pack, but the 6-pack kept the United Nations on the side of its own charter to prevent the scourge of war. And for that 8 months, the UN was part of our global mobilization for peace. It was an extraordinary time. But it took the fact that, yes, Russia and China had made clear they would veto, but it never got to that point, because these other countries played, in many ways, a much more important role of saying, we're not going to allow this to go forward, whether we get a superpower veto or not. And that is something that I think we can look to. I don't know what the Russians are thinking about this. You know, I don't know what role China will play vis-a-vis the Russians. You know, I haven't seen any of it yet, so I'll spend the weekend, I have a feeling, reading a lot of stuff. But so I don't know what the details are. But the notion that something called a peace board that's going to be chaired by the President of the United States, and with the CEO being the disgraced former Prime Minister of the UK, that should be endorsed by the United Nations, is a travesty, an absolute travesty, and should be a crime. It's not a crime, unfortunately. It goes to this question of change the laws, make it a crime. There's plenty of other crimes to go around. But I think that what this is about is a complete rejection of the notion of US power, US colonial return and asking for a UN imprimatur to make it legal. It should be rejected.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, for your insightful questions, and please join me in thanking our three speakers for their clarity, commitment, and scholarship.